Thank you all very much for being here. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you for giving up your valuable time. I also really want to thank Kumar, and SSA. The exegesis of this talk has been going on for quite a while now. And so Kumar and also Upul have made overtures, and I'm very thankful for them for keeping the conversation going to make this happen. And also thank you very much also to everyone at SSA for the very visible and invisible labors which make something like this possible. I want to kind of start this, and the starting point for it is that when I was beginning my PhD research, which was looking at specifically resettlement in Sri Lanka, obviously the Mahaweli project comes up a lot, and something I found interesting, or a phenomenon that I found interesting, is that when you read through a lot of the documents, a lot of the research about the project, and especially before its inception, there's a real sense of the project being extremely political, right? So even when you look at the Hansards, right, there's multiple politicians who are sort of commenting about the project, about what its potential impact might be, and really discussing it in very contested terms, right? One of the other things is also that when you look through how the project has been implemented, the Mahaweli project has enacted really profound changes in Sri Lankan state and society, and those changes are, to me, felt extremely political, right? But on the other hand, when you kind of observe what the discourse around the Mahaweli project is today, it was very difficult not to notice the fact that that level of politicization was not present at all, right? So the infrastructure of the project exists. It exists in very strident terms, right? And you see that infrastructure not just in those places the project has been implemented, but even at the center of it, which is in Colombo, right? Like you will see multiple buildings, institutions that are associated with the project, right? And you see it in the sort of statecraft, right? So there's always been a minister and a ministry for Mahaweli Development, and there's sort of discussion around that, about how the project is working, but not in the sort of political terms that I referred to earlier, right? And that phenomenon is also kind of really evident to me in the social discourse as well, right? So there's an idea that the project has been concluded, and that it's just a part of Sri Lankan politics, right? And sort of the Sri Lankan state and Sri Lankan society, but without really going into what I saw as that sort of really contested terms that the project was seen as before. So that's the kind of starting point for this discussion, that I kind of want to go back to the project, about its implementation, and how it was done, to kind of think of this project and its aspects of it in political terms. And I think doing so is quite kind of important because of the scale and the sort of profound changes that it's enacted. The project is very much a story about Sri Lanka itself, right? And so, yeah, is the starting point to all of that. So just in general terms, the Mahaweli project is the largest multi-purpose development program in Sri Lankan history, and it has a bit of a history from colonial time onwards, especially post-independence with the Galo project, that's the predecessor to the Mahaweli project, and then this gets implemented. And so it spans a huge landmass of the country, right? And it's that geographical scale has only kind of expanded over time. And in terms of its actual implementation, the master plan for the project was devised in the 60s with the government of Sri Lanka and the UNFAO. It's a food and agriculture organization. And it was implemented from 1970. It was meant to have a 30-year implementation period over 3 phases. But with the election of the J.R. Jayawardena government in 1977, the project was accelerated, right? And it was that 30-year period was meant to be cut down to 6 years. Just in terms of looking at the kind of a bit of an overview about the talk and the discussion today, is that I argue that the Mahaweli project has kind of become fused with the Sri Lankan state along a number of different dimensions, right? The way that this has become fused obscures that deeply political nature of the project that I was referring to before. And if we instead examine some of these dimensions, we can see, we can maybe unobscure some of that, that neutralization or depoliticization, and see the project for what I argue it is, which is that a structure by the Sri Lankan state that reveals the state's own ethnocratic and neoliberal nature, right? So just for the purposes of the discussion today, what I'll be doing is going through some of these dimensions. And I want to preface it by saying that these are not an exhaustive or exclusive list of those dimensions. Neither are they discrete, right? So you will see the ways that they kind of overlap with each other and they kind of imbricate upon themselves, right? And so, yeah, I hope also that those dimensions are seen as suggestions, right, to think about the project in a political sense, right? And so definitely really also want to preface this by saying that this is not intended to be a lecture as such. And yeah, I'm very averse to giving deshana. But I hope you take some of those dimensions, right, as sort of thinking points for yourself and for our discussion, right? Okay, so the first way we can kind of think of the Mahaweli project is through this legal or institutional dimension, right? And when we look at the empowering legislation for the Mahaweli Development Program, which is the Mahaweli Authority Act, which was which was enacted in 1970, but especially the empowering legislation for the acceleration, right, which comes in 1979, which is the Mahaweli Authority Development Act, and the sort of special thing about this legislation is that it places the Mahaweli Authority, which is the the authority that is in charge of implementing the phases of the Mahaweli project, it places it above all other public institutions, right? And so the minister in charge and the ministry has, those two entities empower the Mahaweli Authority, and the Mahaweli Authority has enhanced powers of eminent domain, which means to expropriate land, to acquire land, to dispense with land, right? And when you look at, compare it in terms of the Land Development Ordinance, those powers are not accorded to other state entities in the same way, right? And so immediately that places the Mahaweli Authority above, especially the local administrative units. So these are the district secretariats, the divisional secretariats, and even in some senses, in some areas above the ministries of public administration and so on, right? So this is quite a unique legal setup within Sri Lanka, and actually comparatively with many other countries as well, because in essence it creates a state within a state, right? And to sort of support this, there's also a constellation of various state institutions that support the project. This includes, for example, the Mahaweli Economic Authority, as well as a number of directed bodies which are supposed to help with various implementation aspects, right? So the kind of how we can kind of think about this legal institutional aspect is that we can also kind of contextualize it in terms of what was happening with the Jayawardena government that's elected in 1977, and specifically with the 1978 Constitution, right? Which, as we know, was a constitution that really concentrated the powers of the state in the executive, right? And this idea of the state within a state, and this idea of the Mahaweli Authority as this sort of hyperpowered entity, really accords with that sort of executive concentration of powers, right? And it allows for the state to act in certain ways, and it drives and generates this dynamic of executive power, which kind of creates the sense that which creates the sense of what the state is able to do, right, and the kind of parameters of how it's able to kind of control the citizens within the state, right? And when we bring this, when we look at that infrastructure today as well, there's a definite sort of observable effect of these state entities, the Mahaweli Authority, and all the other authorities, entities under it, being able to affect continued administrative changes, right? So, so even something that we see after the war, right? The conclusion of the war is that that there are multiple sort of administrative changes happening in various parts of the project areas. And specifically, you can see that very clearly in the case of the Valioid Divisional Secretariat, which changes. Whose administration has changed over from the administrative district of Anuradhapura to Mullaitivu, right? And the way that the sort of borders around it are drawn, and that the way that that particular as part of the Mahaweli project is controlled, or with the way its administration kind of changes hands, really shows this idea that the legal or the institutional infrastructure that underpins the project has this sort of primacy over the other institutions, right? So this is kind of one way we can look at it. I move on to now look at it in terms of development. And development, as you know, is one of the sort of primary social discourses, around, social and political discourses around Sri Lanka. And at the time of the project's implementation, formulation and then implementation, development is the socio-political discourse in Sri Lanka, right? And the Mahaweli project initially, so through the 60s when it was being devised, was really suffused with this modernization ideology, right? And that ideology held the idea that newly decolonized states in particular needed to have some sort of self-sufficiency, that they needed to be on the path towards industrialization or towards growing their economies, and they also needed to release or address some of the population pressures through sort of increased urbanization and so on that were sort of evident in multiple places across the world, right? And from those angles or from those formulations of problems, the idea that you have these large-scale, multi-purpose projects that have components of irrigation and settlement and so on, those projects were presented as solutions, right? They were devised by these newly independent, decolonized countries themselves, but devised especially through the sort of international development machinery, right? So this is the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, right? So they're all sort of involved in formulating these practices and formulating projects like this as, sort of solutions for these countries, right? Now, when we move on to the point of the acceleration of the Mahaweli project, the discourse around development internationally has changed a bit, right? So it's gone from the sort of very state capitalist model of devising these very centralized large projects, right, to one where states are meant to adhere to the terms of austerity, structural adjustment, and these are things that really come out of the neoliberal turn in global economics from the late 70s onwards, right? And so in that sense, the Mahaweli project is quite interesting, right? Because it appears to be still this massive centralized government-driven program, right? And that seems today to sort of maybe conflict with some of our understandings of what neoliberalism is, right? Which is that you have a very limited state with very limited social and social investment, right? And that the state, runs these, is meant to reduce its budget deficits and so on, right? But when we kind of see the way that the project was implemented through its acceleration, many aspects appear to be very sort of compatible with the idea of neoliberalism, right? So as the project was being implemented and especially accelerated, what that meant was a huge windfall for foreign capital, right? So these multiple and particularly Western companies were beneficiaries of contracts, right, for fertilizer, agricultural products, agricultural machinery, right? And there was suddenly, through the project, a whole constellation of foreign capital being driven into the country, right? And then the sort of networks that creates between between Sri Lanka and as a sort of a beneficiary or client state, right? The project was also really supplemented by multiple bilateral agreements with between the Sri Lankan state and multiple countries, particularly across the West, right? And these agreements provided direct financing, right? So in a sense, it was those countries were subsidizing parts of the project, but there were also a whole range of soft financing options and also concessionary loans, right? And so what these instruments did was essentially create this idea of budget deficits in the country to sort of finance these projects, right? And as a result, it deepened that idea of accumulation of debt that the state was taking on to finance this, right? And with that accumulation of public debt comes the country becoming more vulnerable, right, to being controlled by international financial institutions, and if you want to look at it kind of critically, from neo-colonial control, right? So with the idea of debt, the state becomes really beholden to particularly the World Bank and IMF, right? And they are kind of able to dictate the terms of the local economy in a much deeper and stronger way. And this is exactly what happens through the number of structural adjustment programs that the Sri Lankan state signs on from the 80s onwards, right? And finally, the other sort of critical aspect of neoliberal development is that in post-colonial and newly decolonized states, right, there's an interest in the Western or neocolonial economic structure, right, to maintaining certain states at sort of a certain economic level, right? And that is essentially a pre-industrial level of economic development or economic structure, right? And that really played itself out in Sri Lanka in the sense that the Mahaweli project is not a project of industrialization, right? It was meant to be one of developing particularly agriculture, right, and infrastructure, and it essentially didn't do much to change the class relations in the country, which existed from colonial times. So the landlord-comprador class and the merchant classes sort of presiding over the working class and the poor, right? And those class relations were not disturbed by the Mahaweli project. In many senses, they were deepened, right? And so when you look at it, look at all these different aspects of the way that the state interfaces with the international development machinery, with the class relations, and also with the idea of debt accumulation, the project is, in a sense, a good example of the way that neoliberal development is sort of implemented in a post-colony like Sri Lanka, right? Now, when we kind of move on to the idea of development and development policy. The Mahaweli project is also quite interesting because it becomes embedded into these international policy regimes themselves, right? So one of the strains of this is DIDR, which is development-induced development and resettlement, which is a policy regime that sort of governs the way that resettlement programs are supposed to work when they are part of development projects, right? And the interesting thing about DIDR regimes is that the sort of theorization of it happened as these projects were implemented, right? So many of the sort of leading theorists of DIDR were consultants for projects like the Mahaweli project, right? And so you can kind of see this, these policy regimes as being sort of iterative and iterative policy practices that are sort of happening in these post-colonial countries, right? And that develops the policy. And the notable thing about the Mahaweli project, with all of these sort of policy and international attention, right, and policy activity, is that it continues despite the very dire social outcomes that the project was generating, right? So in terms of the livelihoods of and the lives of the people who've been actually settled, there's continuous reports coming from evaluation bodies that it's not really improving the material conditions of people's lives, that the sort of envisioned utopia, right, of the project and projects like these, which were these egalitarian settler societies that are sort of self-sufficient in agriculture, right, that really hasn't materialized, right? And that remains very much the case today, where we see that international machinery that I was referring to still operating, right? And maybe not in very obvious ways, particularly from Colombo, but when we look at, say, the Mahaweli projects and the Mahaweli authorities agreements with multiple IFIs, so especially the World Bank and the ADB, they're involved very much in these monitoring and evaluation, technical assistance, capacity building, and so on, right? And those investments still sort of continue, and in a critical sense, they're a way of kind of maintaining that discipline that the international development machinery has over a place like Sri Lanka, right? And one of the sort of effects of that that development and the way it's kind of playing out even today is that this sort of aid, this sort of intervention is rendered very technical, right? And so that's one of the reasons why a project like this and the sort of very sort of political aspects of development become less obvious, right? And this happens despite, you know, the textures or like the dynamics of that development changing or acquiring, you know, even new sort of textures, right? So, for example, the fact that in many of the areas of the project and across Sri Lanka, actually, that the spread of financial services, right, particularly microfinance, as well as the spread of agribusinesses, right? Those have become really integral to how the project is operating, right? And because in the absence of the state providing sort of direct interventions, these tools and institutions, particularly of foreign capital, kind of move on, right? And there's been some really fantastic research done by Amali, who has really looked into how those elements sort of are playing out even today, right? So one quite large aspect I also want to touch on is that the project obviously affected huge demographic change, right? And it continued and intensified the project of demography change that the Sri Lankan state was undertaking in post-independence, right? And with the acceleration, this becomes extremely intense, right? So in the acceleration period of 77 to 83, the project was meant to resettle 700,000 people, right? Which is, at that time, was 5% of the entire population of the country, which, if you think about it, is massive, right? And this resettlement, right, it's obviously was, from the start with the Mahaweli project, extremely ethnicized, right? And the people who were being resettled were essentially Sinhala settlers from the southern parts of the country, right? Now, when colonization schemes were sort of first being devised in Sri Lanka through colonial times and even a few projects right at independence, so for example, in Min area, this level of ethnicization of settlement was not being sort of undertaken in that way, right? But with the Galaya project, this changes very quickly, and the way that sort of plays out is not sort of explicit discrimination against non-Sinhala settlers or non-Sinhala people, right? But through sort of quite clever and subtle administrative dynamics, right? So, for example, through the entire sort of Mahaweli project's settlement periods, the directive that came from the authority and from the government was that any settlement had to replicate the national ratios of ethnicities in each district, right? So you can imagine in districts across the east and the north, which obviously did not have many Sinhala settlers at all, right? When you have a directive saying that the majority ethnicity ratio from across the country should be sort of replicated in those districts itself, it essentially means that the government was free to settle exclusively Sinhala settlers, right? And so we see the effect of that very immediately, right? So this is I'm not sure if it's possible to see, but this is the sort of demographic change from the 1940s up to the early 1980s, right? And you can see population across the north and east is increasing like the rest of the country, but this population increase is disproportionately Sinhala, right? So if you look at, say, the figures for so on the left-hand column, so the left-hand side, the figures of change for Sinhala populations in the eastern districts, right? It's 449%, 1,200%, right? And that compares to the rates of change of Tamil population increase, which is half or even less than half of that, right? And as a result, the demographic patterns completely change, right? Especially in the east, where say the Sinhala population goes from something like 10%, right, to 23%, and the Tamil population drops from a near majority down much lower, right? And this happens, within 30-something years, right, which is, barely a couple of generations. And so these are sort of really massive and really profound changes, right? And the thing with demographic change at this sort of scale is that after a couple of generations, it becomes sort of incontrovertible fact, right? So, even just personally thinking about it, I was, sort of growing up and especially through my early education, I was just aware of the eastern provinces. Oh, it's a place where there's, lots of different ethnicities living, in harmony together, right? And it's different to maybe other parts of the country. Where in that there's sort of more of an equality between the numbers of the population, right? But, and even when you do visit the East, right, this becomes, it's visible, right, because there are, lots of Sinhala and Tamil and Muslim people living, right, together. But the sort of origins of that are obviously really difficult to sort of tell if you don't talk to anybody, and even if you do, it might not be possible. And the fact that those origins and the starting points of that were only just very recent, right? A couple of decades ago, is not at all obvious, right? So that sort of incontrovertibility is also another reason why the project, right, and the sort of resettlement that it was undertaking has become sort of very unpolitical, right? So a corollary to this demographic change is changes in the electoral scheme, right? And in a sense, the introduction of universal suffrage in British colonial times sort of activates this idea of electro-majoritarianism, right? So it becomes very quickly clear to single elites and single elite politicians that the way to sort of garner votes is to sort of activate the single identity, right, of voters, right? And settlement projects quickly become part of that because it provides a way for these the single elite, right, politicians to address, create this idea of providing, land, right, and these projects are sort of sold as solving landlessness, but also solving singular landlessness, right? I'm a little bit wary about the use of the word patronage, right? And I think there's a tendency to kind of self-orientalize with this and use it in ways which imply that it's us, people in these post-colonies who are corrupt and beholden to our politicians, and that never happens in the West, right? Which is clearly not the case. But also which, as we saw before with the way that the sort of development machinery works, right? These Western countries are also creating or intensifying whatever corruption exists in these countries, in places like here, right? So I use the term patronage here just to kind of denote a certain dynamic between politicians and voters, right? And that's that sort of compact that exists in the Sinhala polity, right? And we can kind of also think of the construction of the Sinhala peasant here, and there's been a lot of work done about how the colonial governments and then the post-colonial governments really work towards sort of creating this idea of the the Sinhala peasant, the farmer, who is sort of like a timeless quantity, right? So who existed from the ancient period onwards, and then it was the responsibility of the state, right, to look after that farmer and to provide welfare, right, and provide particularly land for that farmer, right? And so that really sort of underlays the electoral dynamic that emerges from the massive resettlement that the Mahaweli project is undertaking. If we look at the technicalities, and this is the extremely nerdy part of the presentation, which is, unfortunately, I'll have to subject you all to it. But multiple delimitation exercises through the post-colonial period codify these demographic changes, right? So what happens is that, particularly under the first past the post system, right, which is very geographically limited, geographically defined, you see the creation of multiple electorates that have mostly Sinhala voters, right, and that end up electing Sinhala MPs, right? And you see that particularly with the creation of the Ampar electoral district, right? And administratively, Ampar is also carved out of the Batiklo administrative district in the 1960s, right? And this electoral district creation kind of codifies that. You see it especially with the Aseruel electoral district, which is kind of notable because in terms of the electoral map, it breaks the contiguity of the north and east, right? And by that point, it's the contiguity of the claimed Tamil Elam, right? And so in a way, you can kind of see that the sort of after effects of this intensive resettlement is creating a sort of political dynamic where the state is administratively and in many senses sort of fighting against the ideas of succession, right? So if we, but when we kind of think about why this is sort of less notable today, one of the reasons is obviously the change of electoral system in 1978, which changes to a proportional system that is based on where the electoral districts are based on the administrative districts themselves, right? And so as a result, you don't see the creation of new single districts as such, right? And that was obvious through first past the post. And some of these changes might be more observable at the sort of local government authority level, which is part of my wider research, so TBC. But putting aside the sort of administrative part of this consideration, the way that post-war resettlement has been happening through the Mahaweli project, right, shows that there's still this ongoing centrality of the vote to these considerations. So in some of my fieldwork, I'm just talking to people who live in areas like Velioya, Manalaru. They were basically handed deeds for land in those areas under the assumption that they would, be registered to vote in those places, right? And so you have people from, say, Kagalo or Hambantota especially, who've been settled, and their official vote is in those areas, right? And so you can see that, it's not quite hidden, right? This idea that the vote sort of informs this dynamic of settlement, right? Still, but as I said, because this resettlement, especially in the post-war era, is not as intensive as, say, during the acceleration of the project, those changes are not as obviously or visibly seen. And so again, as a result, that's also another contribution to the fact that this dynamic is again less visible, less political, right? So just before I move on to the next part, all of these changes, right, of development, particularly demographic change, and then the administrative changes that come with it, or inform all of it, these things were not unnoticed by the people they were being enacted on and the areas that they were enacted on. And so there was, from the beginning, very strong opposition politically, right, from Tamil-speaking communities and especially Lanka Tamil politicians. So the Federal Party and then later on the TULF really took this up and expressed the idea that the Mahaweli project and the sort of project preceding it were not essentially just development projects, but they were essentially single colonization programs, right? And they were single colonization programs that were interfering very directly with the demographics of areas that were predominantly populated by Tamil people, right? And these things sort of really coalesce through the 70s, and you can see it's mentioned specifically in the Vadukodai resolution, right, which was the first to kind of call for Tamil Ilam as a project, that this state planned single colonization was one of the primary reasons why Tamil politicians and the Tamil community were asking and demanding and committing to a separate state, right? So that late 70s and onwards is the start of armed conflict, and this provides another sort of angle to look at how the project is operating. And so as the country really descends into civil war from 1983, we see the Mahaweli project kind of acquiring a heavily sort of securitized element, right? And so it morphs from just being a development project to essentially a mechanism of warfare, right? And this is seen especially in what I call the border villages, which are on the frontier of the battle lines between the Sri Lankan state and the various Tamil militant groups, which eventually becomes just the LTT. And the state does this not quite in all of the formal ways as before, but in a lot of different clandestine ways. So one of these is the way that land itself was acquired, which is to sort of declare that certain lands were absentee lands, so they had the owners were not there, and so the state could sort of annex that land, right? It was also to declare that in certain lands, the people who were living on them, which are Tamil and Muslim people, were encroachers, right? And so they could be evicted as a result. And after this is done, and this is through the military, right? The legal titles are given to the settlers, which kind of formalizes them being there. And the actual places, the names are changed from Tamil names into Sinhala names. So under the land and village naming ordinance, these things happen, right? And so you see even just the example of Velio, which is used to be Mana Laru, right? But officially it's changed, and that's a phenomenon across the north and east. And then eventually, as the war goes on, the people who are living in these border villages are directly armed by the state, right? And so, in essence, what's a development project becomes a military project, right? And as this is happening, the Sri Lankan state and the Sri Lankan government goes full mask off, right? Like, so before it was pretending that, the resettlement, it didn't have any sort of ethnic or racist character to it, that it didn't have any sort of malicious intentions about how the settlement was working. Through the start of the war and onwards, the state and its agents, from all the way from Jayasingh and Gavani Disanaka down to various offices of the Mahaweli project, they explicitly say that this is intended to break Tamil Ila, right? That this war against terrorists cannot push forward, and that the state will use all of its resources, including the Mahaweli project, to stop that, right? And the way that the value and system L of the Mahaweli project was implemented really shows this, right? So it was done through multiple clandestine gazettes, right? And the settlement of singular settlers in those areas and the arming of them, right? And the pouring of a lot of resources by the state into it at a time when the spending constraints of the government become very clear, but resources are being kind of poured into this sort of clandestine and border settlement, right? And this really changes that development discourse into one that takes on these elements of securitization, right? As this is happening, just like with the development discourse, we see that this also has a very strong international component to it, that this sort of settlement is embedded in international policy regimes like conflict-induced development and resettlement. And these policy regimes are being formulated in the centers of global power, like at the UN, by the United States, by the UK, right? But they are being implemented and theorized and formulated in the borders, right? Which is the periphery of that international system, right? And you can really see this through concepts like the borderlands, right? So just as the areas of the Mahaweli are borders to us in Colombo, right? The Sri Lanka itself becomes a border to the sort of core countries, right, in this international scheme, right? And the reason why particularly Western countries are pouring resources into these policy formulations, and as well as the implementation, right? So these countries are still funding the Mahaweli project and funding directly the building of border villages and so on, right? They're doing that in a way to sort of manage the security threats that they themselves perceive, right? So in order to stop people from that are being targeted by this, from say seeking refugee or asylum status in those countries, in those Western countries themselves, the money is being poured into these mechanisms as a domestic solution, right? And so you can kind of again see that just parallel to sort of development discourse, this sort of international security discourse also proceeds in a way of kind of really like implicating a state like Sri Lanka into that machinery, right? These dynamics still persist today. So after the war, militarization has, if anything, increased, and they take on a particular dynamic in the Mahaweli project, and particularly in those border areas, right, where the military is starting from that point on to assume more strongly civic functions, right? So they're taking part in agriculture, even in education, right? In sort of civil administration and so on. And in this way, the military becomes sort of an adjunct to the Mahaweli Authority, and in some senses sort of supersedes the Mahaweli Authority itself, right? And there's a lot of research done, particularly very interesting work by Bart Klim and Tirunelli Kelagama, who really talk about militarization in the sort of peace era, right? So the post-conflict era, as taking on these dynamics where it's a constantly changing thing. It's a built thing that's being built by the state, right? And it's totalizing, right? So the way that the military kind of proceeds here is that they are seen by these singular settlers in these areas as more trustworthy, right, than, say, corrupt government agents, right? And that dynamic is used by the military and the state to sort of prove themselves as indispensable, right? And that really embeds the military into these areas, and as a sort of incontestable fact of life, you know, in Mahaweli areas, and of course life in Sri Lanka itself overall, right? I move on to the sort of final element of this, which is a more sort of broader and hopefully more familiar cultural element of the project, and from the start, and with all of the sort of resettlement projects, there was this idea that they were meant to be this reclamation of the ancient Sinhala hydraulic civilization, right? So our great kings of the past built all these tanks and irrigation schemes, and projects like the Mahaweli project are sort of reenacting that, right, for the modern times. And this is done obviously through the building of the physical infrastructure, but also the cultural elements of ritual, of festival even, of celebration that go along with it. And there's a very interesting and also very important intervention made by Sri Lankan in '87 about the rituals of development, and she goes through the Jala Puja, or the sort of water festivals that are meant to sort of signify harvest, right? These become really, you know, part of this the state and state practice, right? And as a result, also of Sri Lankan society itself. And they're underpinned by the idea that these individual agents, right, or actors in these things also have these cultural aspirations, right? So all the way from DS to Jaya to Emma, they love really kind of proclaiming themselves as, you know, inheritors or heirs to ancient kings, right? So not just Vijaya, but, you know, particularly Parakram Bahu, Dutugamunu, and so on, right? And this is sort of a continuous thread in Sri Lankan sort of political cultural discourse, right? And that's, you know, that continues on to even, you know, you can see it, even Sirisena was trying to get in on that business, right? And the thing with this is that just like all cultural projects, right, there's nothing natural about this, right? So the state has to continuously build it, right, to generate these ideas, to implement them, right? And so the performance of these rituals and the performance of sort of calling themselves all these kings, right, it contributes to the actual sort of physical infrastructures, like the Mahaweli project, becoming embedded, right, and then becoming uncontested, right? And so these are, and that sort of cultural element is also sort of seen as just natural to social discourse. So I'm gonna kind of end it there. And as I said before, the dimensions I was looking at through all of this were not exclusive, right? And there are multiple dimensions that we can look at, including agrarian politics themselves, about the outcomes of full agricultural policy through the Mahaweli project, right? And a lot of the sort of evaluation work done is that while the project achieved some sort of self-sufficiency in terms of food production, that's not seen, or that cannot be considered sustainable, as we know, even especially in these times, right, where rice production itself is a highly volatile agricultural practice, right? And so this, that's kind of a dimension we can look at it. The sort of environmental effects are really profound, right, as a result of the construction, not just of settlement, but of the sort of reservoirs and dams and so on. And that's something that can be looked at, and the actual sort of engineering elements of that as well are things that can be explored. And they are sort of lenses to kind of look at the project and its politicalness, right? So just as a very final postscript to all of this, there was a committee appointed by the cabinet of the current government to look into non-profit state entities, and it just reported back about 2 months ago, and it's recommended that the Mahaweli Authority be disestablished, right? And so this provides kind of a interesting way to kind of frame all of this, what we've been sort of talking about so far. In addition to this potentially being the new dawn of the Punaruddha Yuga, right? But the actual substance of this is that we have all of this infrastructure, right? Social, physical, legal, and so on. What happens when you sort of move the sort of top Jenga block, right? Does it exist in its form as it is, or does it move on to sort of a new iteration of these dynamics? And I think that's a thing we can kind of think about together, maybe. So yeah, I think I'll end it there. So.